Welcome to Canada Bangladesh Social Justice Action Research Alliance. On this platform, we talk about issues that impact social justice locally and globally. We organize these critical and courageous conversations, hoping to promote spaces for critical thinking, hoping this contributes in creating critical consciousness among young students and marginalized communities in Bangladesh and around the world. And we use these conversations as part of action research. So today, our guest is Dr. David Borish. David is a postdoc researcher at School of Arctic and Subarctic Studies, Labrador Institute of Memorial University. And as I just mentioned moments ago, that these conversations are done hoping to create critical consciousness. One of the things that we have seen that a lot of the research that is done at the university, they stay at the university, as we say it many times, that in the ivory tower. So David has done an incredibly important work. He has done his doctoral studies and also used filmmaking as a research methodology. So today we'll hear from David his experience of making film, how he got involved in filmmaking, and many more important conversations. So with that, Dr. David Borish, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the chat.
Thank you, David. So the first question that I have is, how did you tell us about yourself, what you're working on right now, and how did you get involved into filmmaking? I mean, as an academic, as a researcher, that's not probably the most common path, researchers take.
Yeah, totally. So I've always been interested in different social, environmental issues. My undergrad was actually in international development, where I was focusing on environmental and development issues. But throughout my undergrad and my academic experience, I also really wanted to continue to use photography and visual media, film, as part of what I was doing. So kind of on the side of my work, I would work on different visual projects for different NGOs. At one point, I traveled to Malaysia to create my first documentary film about tigers in Malaysia and how that's related to sustainable development. I worked on different projects relating to visual media in Kenya, in Nepal, in other countries as well. So I was really just trying to work on this kind of visual media as a way to share voices and communicate stories. And then that kind of led me into a PhD, which I was not planning on doing at all. In fact, when I finished my undergraduate degree, I had no intentions of even doing a master's degree. But somehow one way or another, I joined this PhD program where I was able to use documentary film in a way that was not just about communication, but also about investigation, exploring, and co-creating knowledge with participants and communities that were trying to share their stories.
That is fascinating. I want to ask you another question on your experience working in Malaysia, and could you tell us more about that? What was that experience like? Making documentary film, and also Royal Bengal tiger is our it's a very respected animal in Bangladesh. We call this is our national animal. So tell us more about it, please.
Yeah, for sure. So I was going on an exchange in my third year in Malaysia at the University of Sains Malaysia in Penang. And I had a really great time there. But while I was there, I really wanted to create some kind of documentary film that was about broadly some kind of wildlife conservation issue, as well as sustainable development. So I ended up reaching out to a bunch of different organizations. And at one point I was thinking about making a film about orangutans or elephants, sea turtles. But the group that really got back to me and was interested in collaborating was a group called the Malaysian Conservation Alliance for Tigers. And in communication with them, they shared kind of the main ingredients to the story and really the main topics of the issue. And in Malaysia, so it's actually not the Bengal tiger, it's another subspecies called the Malay tiger. And it's native to the Malaysian peninsula. And it actually also happens to be the national animal of Malaysia as well. But tigers in Malaysia, as well as tigers in many other parts of the world, they've been on a steep decline over recent years, recent decades. And so the population in Malaysia has really, really shrunk down. And I think one of the differences between maybe Malaysia comparing to, say, India or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh is that because Malaysia is so heavily covered in tropical rainforest, it's very, very challenging to actually see these tigers. I worked with someone that was one of the top tiger biologists in Malaysia. She's been studying tigers for years and years, and she said she's never even seen a tiger in real life, at least in Malaysia. Maybe it's changed since then, but all to say that they are very lucrative. So anyways, I got involved in this project where we were trying to communicate the plight of the tiger, the declines of the tiger, but not just about the tiger, how this animal was connected to the health and well-being of the forests, the health and well-being of the country as it was connected to the development of the country. And very important also was connected to the indigenous peoples in the region. So part of the story that we looked at was how one of the main ranges for the tiger in Malaysia was also overlapping with the traditional lands of an indigenous group called the Batak people, who are still a nomadic group of people that live in the tropical rainforests of Malaysia. And they have lived there for many, many generations, thousands of years. But recently they've been, I guess, pressured and distressed with the kind of modern pressures that the Malaysian society and government have been putting on them. So they are, for the most part, a lot of their homelands, their forests have been taken away for the creation of palm oil plantations. And this, of course, overlaps with the issues with the tiger and other wildlife, because as the forest declines, it's not just about the forest, it's about the animals that live in the area, about the people, like indigenous peoples that live in these forests, but also because, all these things are connected to urban Malaysians as well. So all to say that this film was really about showcasing the deep connections between a conservation issue as well as the sustainable development of a country and indigenous well-being.
Oh my God, I have got so many questions. I think the interview is would take a completely different turn. I also want to stick to the point of making film as a tool for knowledge translation. I often say this and also take pride in the matter, like in Canada, at the universities, we have a priority of knowledge translation. The universities are run by public tax with public tax money. So therefore, the knowledge that is produced at the university should benefit people. So a lot of the scholars have argued that art or film is a very effective tool for knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization. Could you define for us, without using academic language or jargon, that what exactly is knowledge translation to you, and how do you think that film could be an effective tool for knowledge translation?
Yeah, so I think broadly, knowledge translation is just the idea of communicating what you found. And this is one of the things that I've realized throughout the academic process is you can find the most incredible finding that could be life-changing for the world. But if you don't know how to communicate it, then it doesn't mean much. So it's so important for researchers, as well as so many other people, to be able to share what they've learned in ways that are understandable, and I think understandable to different audiences. So not just coming up with findings and results that are going to stay within the academic bubble, but finding ways to really share this information to the public or to policymakers or to others that are going to actually do something with this information. And it's not always possible depending on what field or what project you're in, but I think generally speaking, it's very, very important to communicate this information. And so what I think film does for that process is almost everyone knows, either consciously or not, that film is such an accessible way of communicating. It's as close to being there in real person as you're ever going to have. I mean, there's a reason why we're communicating over live video right now. Video is something that is understandable, it's engaging, it's emotional, it's personable. And even if you don't understand maybe the language, maybe you're not literate, you can't read, whatever it might be, video is a way that can share a lot of the same information in these kinds of accessible and understandable ways. So I think that film, and in particular documentary film, can play a very, very vital role in the ways that academics and researchers communicate their knowledge.
Yeah, and I want to now go into your doctoral work. That for your doctoral work, you have worked with Canadian Indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know anything about Indigenous people in Canada until I came to Canada as an international graduate student. And I was very troubled, to be very bluntly honest, to understand, Canada's brutal past, and continues to be how the Indigenous people of Canada continues to be marginalized in so many ways, which is not a very common knowledge internationally. I also did my graduate studies in development studies. Little did I know about Canada, its Indigenous people and its systemic oppression. You have worked with a community that is vulnerable, that has been historically oppressed. Tell us about your project and your work experience of working with a community, like Canadian Indigenous communities.
Yeah, so I guess a little bit of background on my project specifically. So I got in touch with some professors about an idea of working on some kind of film because I was interested in the work that they were doing. And they said that the communities they were working with and had really long-standing partnerships for years and years was Inuit in Labrador. So Inuit are northern Indigenous peoples in Canada. And one of the things that Inuit had been wanting to share was some kind of documentary film about their relationship with caribou, which is an animal that is, for those of you who don't know, well, if you know what Santa's reindeer are, reindeer are the same species as caribou, but in North America we call them caribou, and they're wild. They're not domesticated. So Inuit have very strong connections to this animal, but caribou populations in recent years have been declining, and so as they're declining, different Indigenous groups, including Inuit, have not been able to access these caribou in the same ways that they did in the past. And kind of building on that, the government posed a total hunting ban in the region that I'm working in called Labrador. So Inuit have been disconnected from this animal that has been a really important part of their food security, their culture, their stories, their emotional well-being, their livelihoods. This animal is connected to all aspects of their life. And so they wanted to create some kind of documentary film that portrayed this relationship, portrayed the ways that their communities were being affected by these declines of a species and the hunting ban, which now detaches them from being able to interact with this animal in the same ways. So my work was partly to create this documentary film in collaboration with these communities, but it also became a PhD degree, a whole research project, because I was using film not only to communicate their stories, but as I mentioned before, to also explore these stories from a more analytical lens and being able to use the qualitative data from these interviews, from this video process, to create academic outputs like journal articles and provide data back to these communities.
Yeah, thank you, David. Now, we've got two very important questions already posed to us,
Sure.
to you, actually, sorry. Suraya Firdos, a very good friend of mine and a development worker, development professional. Her question is that, what is a community-based documentary film? Is the film made based upon a targeted community? She's from Bangladesh.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thank you for that. So I think that what a community-based film looks like very much depends on the context. And it's not like there's like a clear line where, as soon as you involve the community this way, then all of a sudden it's a community-based film. I think it really depends on what makes sense in the context with the group of people that you're working in. In our case, it's community-based in the sense that community members and communities as a whole are in control of the visual content and the research process. So everything that we do, it's not like it's academic researchers like myself going in, extracting information, leaving, and not contacting these communities again. Everything that we do is in collaboration with these people. So as an example, we recently had a film screening with some of our partners in Labrador, so that we're making sure that the documentary film we're working on is exactly how people want it to be. Actually, this entire film project, this research project, is led by Inuit. From the initial phases of kind of conceptualizing it, to the actual kind of methodological practices of going out into the communities. When I went into these communities, I was working in partnership with a community coordinator who was Inuit from that land. So they were co-creating the knowledge with us. And they're also very much in control over the actual data itself, in the sense that they own it all. I am being, blessed with the opportunity to work with this information and to help create it and help work with it and, gain the research aspect from it. But at the end of the day, I don't own this information. It's their information, it's their visuals, it's their data to use in the ways that they want. So that's kind of some of the aspects that are important when creating a community-based film. I think the main kind of idea is that communities are in control of the process, and they're the ones that are leading it as well.
I want to ask you a rather challenging question. And there's a very famous book, pretty much I think any graduate student in North America, at least in Canadian context, they probably read this book when they come to research ethics, is Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Twai-Smith. So could you tell us that when a lot of scholars think that research itself could be a process of colonization, and historically research has been used to colonize, particularly the part of the world that I come from, South Asia, one of the things that I can say with a bit of sadness and also some hurt feeling, I'm not going to hide it, is that one of the things that the colonizers or the Europeans, what they have done in India, in South Asian context, that they have replaced our knowledge production system, our epistemology, our ways of knowing with the colonial education. Of course, with a very explicit goal that they wanted to create collaborators. They wanted to create a group of Indians who are brown in skin, but British in their mind. And that was exactly the speech given by the then Viceroy of British India, Thomas Livingston Macaulay in 1834. So that, as an educator, that makes me very skeptical when I think about knowledge production, and I'm very aware and sensitive towards epistemic violence. So, David, you as a scholar, as a filmmaker, how do you see knowledge production as a process of colonization, and how do you reflect on the historical event that where knowledge production was part of colonization?
Absolutely. So first of all, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that academia and Western kind of science, Western ways of understanding the world, that has played a very important and unfortunately devastating role for a lot of colonial processes. And just thinking about the academic process in general, like I said earlier, it was a lot of the time these largely white researchers going into the field and collecting data and leaving and using this information in ways that didn't necessarily align with the people that were actually going to be affected by it. So I think that is a hugely important problem to address. And myself as a white settler researcher from Canada, I've had to think very deeply about, these kinds of issues in general, but how my position influences this within the specific context that I'm working in, because white settlers have had really devastating effects, around the world, but in my context, in the Canadian North and with Indigenous peoples, they've had a pretty sad legacy for the most part. So it's been important for me to figure out how I fit within this larger project and this picture more broadly. And I think touching on how to kind of move forward with this, I think one of the really key aspects of my work was using film in ways that support the decolonization of research. And one way that I think happens is that, at least in the context that I'm working in, a lot of Indigenous communities, they have oral, traditional knowledge systems. A lot of their information isn't necessarily written down like it is in a lot of Western approaches. And that has been seen, I think, from a lot of kind of Western scientists as being inferior, when of course it's not. It's just a different way of communicating, understanding, and preserving knowledge. And so what film really helps on that whole side is that it's helping and supporting people to continue their traditions of oral storytelling, of visually communicating, and in ways that are still documenting it. It's using this information in ways that align with community values, priorities, goals. So it's very much a tool and an approach and a strategy that can align with some of the cultural benefits and values that these communities already have. And so having these communities and these individuals stay in control of the process through things like film, I think can be helpful in trying to decolonize the research process.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your honest and very honest answer. One of the question has been posed by Dr. Shongita Roy, that can Dr. Borish reflect on the ethical implications of working with researching Indigenous people and other methodological concerns in filmmaking with such communities? I think you have touched on a lot of it, but and you have said that you being a white settler researcher, how I want to add with Dr. Shongita's question is, how did this help you to understand your own subjectivity and in a way to go in a process which is not only essentially intellectual, but could be spiritual, could be understanding that how our own subjectivity can be implicated in many ways that actually creates and reproduce the epistemic violence that has been foundational for colonial violence. So how this has been transformative, or has it have an impact on you personally and the process collectively?
Definitely, yeah. So maybe just to start on more of the ethical implications, I think that potentially as a concern for doing this kind of work is because it's visual, you're documenting so much, which can be really, really positive and great in a lot of cases. But if it's misused in any way, then it can be potentially worse than just any kind of text-based output, because it's very identifying information. So with that comes a lot of responsibility for our team and myself as a filmmaker to document people in ways that do justice to themselves and the story at large. And so if I were to, for example, interview someone and misrepresent them, and then have their name and their face and their visuals all tied to that information that is misrepresenting, that can potentially lead to issues. So thinking about those kinds of ethical implications and making sure that working collectively, collaboratively with people to make sure that the story that's being put out there is doing justice to what people really want to be told is a huge, huge responsibility and big undertaking that needs to be considered very strongly. In terms of kind of the subjective aspects that you were mentioning, I think that filmmaking in general, as well as research, is a very subjective process. And I think that sometimes people think that subjectivity is almost like a bad thing, when really it's just an inherent part of how we understand things. And so, especially with something like filmmaking, I'm not trying to hide my own subjectivity in the process or the subjectivity of anyone else on our team. This is very much a subjective process. But that's not only okay, it's good. That adds strength to it, because it is very much a message coming from this group of people. This is what we want to say. This is the message that these communities want to put out about their experience with the decline of a species and how they're being affected by it. And so having that kind of collective subjectivity can really add to the strength of the kind of storytelling outputs that are put out there, as well as, in effect, the research outputs. And just to briefly touch on my own subjectivity, because of course, me as a filmmaker, I played a huge role in this. As I did a lot of the editing, the majority of the editing of the film, and my own experiences totally reflect the way that I, captured the visuals, how I'm putting the story together. So being very upfront and transparent about that has been really, really important. But making sure that it's not like I'm just doing it on my own. Sending this information back to the people that are part of this story, our larger team in Labrador, our partners in both the Inuit regions that we're working in, and have everyone contribute to the story has been really, really key in order to help balance those subjectivities.
Thank you, David. One of the things that I have realized coming to North American academia and being in the thick of it is that what you just have addressed, that writing research objectively, and what happens that I have seen that people from the margin, when they're trying to write their experiences, a lot of the times academia tries to, the gatekeeping process, right, tells them that you are writing too passionately, your language is too strong, this is too subjective, so on and so forth. But you just have mentioned about decolonizing research. One of the ideas of establishing and peddling European superiority, or in the epistemic spaces, putting forward the Eurocentric visions, Eurocentricity, is that Europeans are rational, they are logical, they're not emotional. Hence, this is their superiority. Therefore, they have the moral responsibility, very much like, the white man's burden, Rudyard Kipling, right? That, therefore we are out there to go and civilize the rest of the world because they are emotional. They cannot see the world objectively. I want to say that the process is very much alive. The process is alive but subtle, that a lot of the times when people from marginalist background, because of my engagement in the universities, collective engagement, first I came here to Canada and I worked as an international steward for international graduate students. So there I came to know intimately that the experiences international students go through when they're navigating not only academic life, but also social and cultural life, right? So that's something that, just to put that up front, that, this is my subjective interpretation of this, and this is me. And I think with film, it's even more necessary because you're the one who is deciding which shot to keep. You are the one who is deciding the frame. So therefore, which frame to keep and which frame not to keep, and therefore which story to tell, it's incredibly important. Let's take a question from Mohima. Mohima Rahman Srishti asked a question that how to ensure as much as possible that films as a KT tool, knowledge translation tool, have policy implications or positively impact policymaking. Wonderful question. Thank you, Mohima.
Yeah, I think that's a great question as well. And that is one of the main, I think, hurdles, challenges to kind of address as a filmmaker and as a researcher. I think it really depends on what topic you're talking about, which audiences you're trying to really communicate to. Speaking from our own experience, so we are currently in production for this community-based film, and we're hoping to release it later this year. But in terms of that influencing policy and policy making, we're going to do whatever we can to get this in the hands of people that are in those positions. And I guess some films might have a direct message that is geared towards like, this film is all about trying to change this policy. That's not really what our film is about. It's more so trying to share this kind of collective story of Inuit and caribou and this animal, to, I mean, broadly promote awareness on these deep connections between wildlife conservation and indigenous well-being and lives. So it's not direct in the sense that, you know, we want to change this policy, but in doing so in the way that we are, we're still trying to influence the ways that policies are thought about and understood. And again, through using something like film, it's accessible to everyone. So whether you are, you know, in school, maybe primary school, trying to watch some of this information, or you're a policymaker that is from outside the region, hearing voices on the ground can add so much more depth to your understanding than simply reading about it or just seeing maps or whatever it is. So I think that by creating documentary film work more broadly, that will allow policymakers and many other audiences to interact with these kinds of issues in more emotionally engaging ways.
I think one of the fundamental things about filmmakers, and filmmakers, you know, are very upfront about it, is that the purpose of making film is to emote, to elicit emotional response to about certain matters. Logically speaking, we want to claim that, you know, we are rational, but if we only pay an honest look to our actions, it will be very clear that how logical and rational we humans can be. Also, I think Marshall McLuhan was pretty clear about it, is that the medium is the message, is that, you know, it is the medium that tells the story, not essentially the message. And I think one of the recent time best evidences that we can possibly think of, in my experience, in my knowledge, is when George Floyd was brutally murdered, the movement wouldn't have happened the way it has if it wasn't for a 17-year-old Black woman, her bravery, her courage. She stood there, she stood the ground, and she filmed it. So we might think, and I try to, and we train young boys and girls in Bangladesh, in rural Bangladesh, that basically how to use these tools. Someday, I would love you to actually have a conversation with the young, aspiring filmmakers in the villages of Bangladesh to and how they're learning to use this, you know, digital tools. I think it is more important than ever, because texts and media, and, you know, you write whatever you can. And I say this to a lot of my academic friends, professors and scholars, say that, you know, it's very incredibly important for you to participate in this kind of conversation, because all the thoughts that you have, doesn't matter how hard you try in your lifetime, I don't think you'll be able to write all of that. So at least participate in a conversation, you're sort of like recovering. And it's also, in my humble opinion, it's also a way of decolonizing research, is that the oral tradition, conversation, documentation, this has been the longest tradition of knowledge. If I tell you from the part of the world that I come from, so many of the incredibly important work, they were collected from oral tradition. They were not written, but subsequently people have gone and written about it. Now I'm going to ask a challenging question for both you and me, and, you know, as researchers, is that a lot of the times, probably most of the times, we treat communities as sites of epistemic extraction, knowledge extraction. I go there, I do my research. I mean, I usually say it this way, that when the dissertations are done, papers are published, doctorate degrees are awarded, a lot of the communities don't even get to know that what has been researched about them, because we write them in very academic, inaccessible language, which in a way is very intellectual elitism. It's another way, and again, in my humble opinion, I find it fundamentally colonial, hierarchical. So what is your take on that? And how do you grapple with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of relates to what we were saying earlier, just about how things are kept within this academic bubble. And I totally agree with you. I think that as information is created, there are these academic systems that force people to write in a certain way or publish in a certain way. You know, there's all this stress and pressure to create journal articles or books or all these things that are largely not accessible to the average person, even if they have access to read it, which most people don't because they don't have access to different libraries or university systems. Even if they did, the writing, the style, the big words, it's a lot of jargon that, not saying that it's not important. I think there's definitely a place for that, but it is inaccessible to a huge chunk of the population. And so that is, it's exclusive. And I think that is tied to the kind of colonial nature of academia. And so I think that as this broad industry field changes and evolves over time, I think it needs to become more and more accessible to broader audiences. And a big part of that is using understandable language, understandable mediums such as photography and film, so that people can understand these issues. And this is also a really important part of actually creating positive, practical change. And just as a very, basic example, we've got something like, COVID going on right now, and there's so much research, so much evidence about, how vaccines work. But yet there are still so many people out there around the world that are hesitant or skeptical. And so, again, that's a very kind of direct and practical way of how important knowledge translation is for actually creating positive change. And, that this is a problem that directly affects everyone. Think about issues and problems that are way more abstract, way more difficult for people to understand, maybe way more long lasting, such as something like climate change. So getting information out in ways that is consumable, understandable, accessible it should be a priority if it's not.
To add to that, it's not only written in inaccessible language, and then you have the payment wall. Like from Bangladesh, I mean, I remember it, and I tell this to a lot of the students that I mentor and I work with. If you don't have access to, like, at our universities are paying millions of dollars. University of Guelph, University of Toronto, they're paying $2, $3, $4 million, only to have the access to all these libraries, right? So to me, it's almost confounding that these knowledges are produced with taxpayers' money, but when the output comes, it's not essentially benefiting the researchers. I can't buy a paper with $30 if I'm living in Bangladesh. And so I'll give you another very practical example. To this day, millions of children young students in Bangladesh, they think Columbus was a discoverer. I grew up thinking Columbus was a hero. Now, when I engage in conversation with the kids, with the students that I teach, and I engage with them, critical conversations, I'm reworking that. No, he was an architect of genocide. He was a murderer. He has led a way that has terminated nearly 98% indigenous people in North America. So please, let's change. I mean, to this day in Bangladesh, imagine a man, his name was, so basically his name is Lord Curzon. He was at one point in time, was the Viceroy of British India. The largest province of British India was Bengal, where I'm from, and Bengal was the richest part of the world, let alone Indian subcontinent, right? So when Lord Curzon understood that the Bengalis, people who speak Bangla are called Bengalis. Bengalis are getting critical about the British oppression, and they were organizing, the good old British policy, divide and rule, right? So Lord Curzon has divided Bengal based on the religious line to sow the seed of hatred. To this day, a lot of the Muslim and Hindu conflict and hatred is rooted in British divide and rule policy. So the biggest university in Bangladesh, we call the Oxford of the East, one of the most prominent halls is named after Lord Curzon. We have, the part of the country that I'm from, There's universities called Edward University. It's like named after a British guy. Cox's Bazar is named after the British guy. So we don't get to know. So if we are teaching our kids to read mechanically, so if you at a doctoral level, at a postdoctoral level, the knowledge that you're producing, to what extent that is actually benefiting people? And if not, how are to deal with it? Now, I have a technical question for you. A lot of my students, they aspire to become a filmmaker. At the same time, they have academic ambition. What would you say that some of the challenges of becoming at the same time a researcher and a documentary filmmaker?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I was really kind of struggling with when I was, I guess, in my undergrad, and even to now. It was trying to find ways to do both, because I wanted to do both. I wanted to explore things in depth through research and through other means, but also work on storytelling outputs that were meaningful and communicative. And so one of the things that I found, part of my doctoral research was actually trying to advance documentary film as a methodological strategy for collecting, documenting, and analyzing qualitative data. So a big part of my work was to try to repurpose, for example, video editing software to be able to actually analyze qualitative data through these softwares. So in my view, and over the past 4 years of my work, I was really trying to find the synergies between these two seemingly very different industries, filmmaking and research. But as I got more and more into it, and I think many people kind of understand this too, there's a lot of synergies. There's a lot of overlaps between qualitative research and filmmaking. Because, for a good documentary film, when you're doing these interviews, you're trying to set up interviews in the same ways, where you're trying to provide, comfort to the participants. You're trying to learn from their own experiences, hear what they have to say. And all this information that you would be doing through a kind of video interview, that can all be analyzed and used for research purposes as well. So all to say that one of the struggles that I found was trying to make these linkages, but it's becoming more and more clear to me that there are linkages that are still not really understood very well in academia, at least in Canada. I think there's very few people doing this kind of work. But in my view, I think that it's going to continue to evolve, and academics, researchers, and others are going to continue to use film and visual media in ways that aren't just about communicating stories. So one of the things that I would recommend for people that are aspiring, filmmakers or researchers or whatever it might be, I would say that try to be as creative as you can, and creative not just in this kind of visual sense, but creative in the ways that you can use these tools that are available to us. Because there's a lot of great technology out there, even with our phones, but there are different ways that you can use it, and you can find linkages to blend it into academic research if the environment allows.
And to add to that, do you think it's common among professors to allow their doctoral students to welcome and inspire that, okay, so you can make a documentary film as part of your doctoral research?
Yeah, so this is another big challenge. I think that having a supportive environment is really, really key. And I was very lucky to be surrounded by advisors that are very, very, I think they're innovative in general, but they see the potential and the connections between digital media, visual media, and in-depth qualitative work. They understand it, and they're part of the reason why I was able to do what I did, is because they are supportive of these things. And my department as well at the University of Guelph was very open to having some kind of part of my dissertation that wasn't just a written chapter or an article. It could actually be this kind of creative output. So having these kinds of broad understandings and support for something like a film as not just a bonus, thing that you do on the side of the rest of your whole dissertation, but as an inherent part of the research, having that environment is really, really important. And I think that is probably one of the biggest hurdles for most students and most people that want to do this work. And I don't know what it's like in Bangladesh. Maybe some of the universities are not as open to these kinds of new ways of using visual media, but I can only see this kind of progressing more and more, where there is more understandings of these approaches. And just thinking about other methodologies that have been used over the past decade or so, things like photo voice. That's something that seems to be pretty popular now and is recognized as an in-depth practice for collecting data, and it's using photography. So yes, I think it's a big hurdle if you don't have that kind of supportive environment, but not to say that you can't still find it, and there aren't people out there that will support this kind of work.
Okay, I'll ask you a few more follow-up questions exactly on the methodology, and so that we can document it, and for our audience and in the future who is going to watch this video. Because I know quite a few visual anthropologists in Bangladesh who are doing incredibly important work, and their work is research. But I don't think that I have seen in academic circles in Canada, in overall, like in academic circles, that understanding the significance of visual media as a tool to research. So why do you think that your professors, your supervisors, your committee, so tell us about your department? I know, but I want for the audience, tell us that why do you think that your supervisors supported your work? And 3, that how did you finally made this documentary film as part of your doctoral dissertation?
Yeah, so I think simply put, the reason why there was support for this work is because the communities we were working with, Inuit in Labrador in northern Canada, they wanted to create some kind of documentary work. They wanted to create some kind of storytelling output that could be connected to research, but regardless, that's what they wanted. That's what aligned with their priorities and their values. So that as a starting point was so important, and really the foundation for doing this work in the first place. So having that kind of on the ground support and need for this kind of approach allowed me to explore it in ways that I probably would not have been able to do otherwise. In terms of some of the other questions you asked there, my department was actually the population medicine in the Ontario Veterinary College at the University of Guelph. So I'll be honest, I don't think I totally fit in there with everyone else. I think it was very much focused on really great work around human and in particular animal health. But it's not like everyone was working on films there. It's not like everyone was doing all these creative arts-based approaches. Some people were, but definitely not all. So it was more so just the flexibility to work on these kinds of things within that department. But I think there's other departments, there's other schools around Canada and probably elsewhere that are much more open and geared towards using creative practices as these kind of research approaches. And I'll just add that if anyone is interested, one of the things that I recently published and worked on is a new paper, as well as almost like a how-to guide that goes step by step through the approach that I took for using documentary film as a tool for qualitative research. So if anyone's interested in, I guess, these broad topics in general, I'm happy to share that information with them, and it might be informative for things that might happen in Bangladesh or elsewhere.
Yeah, and if it is okay that if somebody reaches out to me, somebody's interested, that basically, as I said, that payment wall. If somebody wants your paper, so can they reach out to you or through me?
Of course, yeah. I mean, either or, but I'm happy to talk with anyone that's interested in this. And even if someone wants to chat later on over a call or a Zoom or whatever it might be, to talk about how they want to use visual media, documentary film, whatever it might be. Happy to talk with anyone.
So we already have an audience who has already expressed that I'm interested in the paper. So maybe
Okay,
if you
great.
send it, I send it to me, I will be able to circulate, among anybody who is interested. Now, how did that become part of your dissertation finally?
How did that approach, you mean?
Mhm.
Yeah, so I guess my dissertation as a whole was really, I kind of see it as split down the middle. Part of it was very much focused on using documentary film as this kind of methodological approach. So I was trying to advance it. I was trying to write about it. I was trying to show how it could be used to co-create knowledge with communities. And then the other part of my dissertation, the other half really, or more, was the actual content, the knowledge created from this process. And so a lot of that work was looking at Indigenous well-being and health, the connections between this animal, caribou, and Inuit identity, emotional well-being, social connections between different communities, food security. All these things came out in different qualitative papers in my dissertation, but that was a product of the approach that we took.
Okay. Okay. Now, tell us that in terms of knowledge translation, because you have worked on a project that was film, and what about the accessibility? Who has access to, let's say, somebody who is in Canada or some part of the world, they want to know David's work, that basically how he created a film and so on. So is it open? Is it free? And how does it work?
Yeah, so I'll say that as I mentioned, we're working on a community-based film. It's in production right now. We're sending it out to different communities this summer so that they can provide their feedback. They can look at it. But we're hoping that in the fall it will be public. It will be published and will be accessible for years to come for anyone around the world. We aren't in a position for that to be shown yet, but if it's helpful, I can send along a link to our project website, which houses all the research that we're doing, as well as the visual content. Actually, could I pop it into the chat right now? Would that work? Or, sorry, you were muted there.
Yeah, yes, please. Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sending a link there. Hopefully people can see that.
Yeah. What I'll do, I will just post it right now here so that anybody who is interested can see it. Yeah. So now it's in the
Okay,
comment. So
great. So yeah, that's one place where you can take a look at the work we're doing. It will house a lot of the video content. It has photos that we captured of people, of places, of their quotes kind of tied together. And of course the research, including that paper I was talking about around using documentary film as a tool for qualitative research.
Yeah, and also one of the things that I want to say to our audience, and especially the students in Bangladesh, I particularly know this as an educator, that in order to tell a story, I mean, I know a lot of incredibly brilliant photographer. I know very young aspiring filmmakers. Again, one of the colonial hierarchy is that English is a very elite language. Academic English is a very elite language. Not everybody has access to it. So in case of Bangladesh, and by the way, whenever I'm talking about Canada and the North, global North, I'm very critical, just as I'm looking for ways to improve how we can get things better in Bangladesh as well, is I don't think that I would be able to write the way I can write if I was not an educator where the medium of instruction was English. And because I used to teach economics, so a lot of the literature that I taught and read, it was very, very much Western, literature. But what happens is, young aspiring filmmakers, they can tell powerful stories. But when it comes to academia, that barrier, right? That gatekeeping is that, are you writing in this particular manner, or else you shall not have access to this, palace. So I'm sorry if that sounded, a bit
Yeah, no.
resentful, but this is what it is. I mean, I know they can tell a story. I know that how a lot of students who do not come from very noticeable privileges, how they're, dare I say the word, bullied on whether their preposition is right, or the sentence that they're saying, they're writing, is it grammatically accurate? I'm not saying that one should not aspire to write sentences that are not grammatically, wrong, but even there is politics of grammar. Even there is the fact that whose grammar is that? Whose language is that? Whose language am I writing in? So I feel in a language. I mean, in order to, for instance, I mean, I'm just taking your example because I know you, as a collaborator, I know you as a person, as a friend. That's what I'm saying this. Otherwise, I wouldn't have said that to you. That if I would have taken you to Bangladesh and I would have told you that, David, why didn't you write your dissertation in Bangla? What would happen to you?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good point. And I think just the idea of one language being not superior in any way, but that it's prioritized in certain countries and around the world. It's totally a privilege to be, an English speaker as my native language, and really not having to deal with some of these challenges that so many other people face in trying to learn a different language. And that I don't think is recognized enough, not just in academia. I think just in society in general. There are people all the time that make fun of foreigners for speaking in a different accent or whatever it might be, and it's difficult to learn a different language. And so yeah, I think that seeing the ties between languages as well as the kind of colonial history behind them, what is prioritized, the politics behind it, it's important to consider.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the tools that I use for teaching language, the politics of language to students, in the students that I teach every day from my village and from the area where I'm from, is that I present the world map. Then I ask them, what do you think that Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, these countries, and Britain, why do you think that all these places English is spoken? Why do you think that 54% everything is in internet? Everything in internet, 54% is in English. Why do you think that the highest number of papers published at any point in time is in English? So my research, digital disinformation, I know for a fact that more than 98% publications are in English. But you see, it's the people in Global South, their lives are researched, but the knowledge is produced in English. So I think someday, we become very aware of it, and we don't suffer from that, inferiority complex that. And I'm unapologetic about it now. Like, for instance, some of the times that I'm speaking, I will probably not use the right preposition or grammar or number here and there, and I have zero qualms about it. I know that I'm sincere about correcting it, but if somebody comes to correct my grammar, I have an answer that there are other contents in my conversation that you can probably engage in. So one of the last questions that I have, we have come towards the end of our conversation. What is your recommendation or your experience or things that you have learned in order to actually improve, develop knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization? As a filmmaker, things that you have seen in your experience while you're doing your dissertation, and you felt like, oh, I wish this would happen, this would happen. So what are some of the things that you would like to say?
I think that, what do I want to say about this? I think before embarking on any kind of film project, you need to be really conscious of why you're doing it in the first place. And this is something that, even myself in the early stages, I didn't think about too much. We often overlook, what the real reason is. But just asking yourself, like, why are you trying to communicate? Like, why are you doing it? And until you have a really solid understanding of why you want to do something in using documentary film, visual media, why you're trying to communicate, I think it will be hard to really figure out how you're going to do it in the first place. So asking yourself that very critical question on why, it's basic, but it's foundational. I think thinking and reflecting very strongly on the audiences you're trying to communicate to In some cases, it might be the general public. It might be everyone. In other cases, it might be directed towards specific individuals from specific industries or whatever it is. So being very clear on who you're trying to communicate to and what makes sense to communicate to those people. Another thing to think about, I think, in depth is what message you're trying to tell and what feelings you're trying to evoke. And you don't necessarily need to know that right away. In fact, I think that it might be harmful to the process if you already have a message in mind, because then you're a little bit close to what could come and emerge from the actual filmmaking process. And this is one of the things that I think is really, at least my style and my take on research and filmmaking more broadly. I don't storyboard that much. You know, I go in and try to collect and hear from people in open-ended questions as much as possible. And oftentimes you almost find the story in the editing. You find the story after you've talked to so many people. That's where you begin to, you know, not think so much about your own preconceived ideas, even though of course it affects it, but you hear the story from the people themselves rather than coming and saying, this is the message, this is how I'm going to tell it. So thinking about those questions, I think, is important.
I'm sorry, I want, can I ask one question?
Of course, yeah.
So I have a lot of filmmaking friends who are filmmakers. So you have one group of people who make fiction films, and then you have the other group who is a documentary filmmaker. And a lot of the times, even the fiction filmmakers will recognize the fact that making a documentary film is much more harder than making a fiction film. I'm not saying making fiction film is easy. You have to know your art as well. You're a documentary filmmaker, and being a filmmaker, you know the technique pretty much, like, you know, how camera, light, sound, all of that works, and, you know, all that. Why do you think that some people think that making a documentary film is harder than a fiction film?
I think it totally depends on what it is you're looking at, but I think broadly speaking, documentary, you're not in control of the process as much. You know, you're documenting, you're looking at real things as much as possible. And so I think if you're a filmmaker that is used to more fiction, or maybe not even fiction, but things where it's you're in control of the process of what people are saying, then it's almost easier. I think I've never actually worked on any fiction, so I can't say from personal experience, but there's more control. Versus documentary could be, you know, you might have an idea, and then by the end of it, you're going to go through a complete, you know, different meandering path and come out with something different potentially. So there's less control, more uncertainty, which can be unnerving at times and stressful. But I think when you do it properly and well, it can be a really, really engaging output that is informative and entertaining and engaging for people.
I'm sorry, I've missed a question, you know, from Dilara, one of our very, very good friends. Always asks amazing questions. In doing your work, are you considering social impact assessment?
That's an interesting question. So I personally have not done any kind of social impact assessment, at least in kind of a formal way. But I definitely think that that kind of approach can be tied in to this kind of documentary research approach. I thought about, you know, cultural impact assessment as well as environmental impact assessments. And I think having this kind of information can be a really great way to explore how people are feeling about certain issues. And so, yeah, short answer, yes, I think there's definitely a power of using this kind of tool for an approach like a social impact assessment, because you're hearing it from people in as natural way and as real a way as you're ever going to get, aside from being there in person. So that information is useful and valuable for a variety of reasons.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much for, you know, taking some time and, you know, having this conversation with us. At this conversation, you know, we'll be watched and rewatched, and we learn. And probably if somebody has any question, they reach out to me. I'll reach out to you for those questions. And I personally think that this is something like an ongoing dialogue. We are not able to get to the bottom of things in just one conversation, things that are historical. It was very helpful to have this conversation going with you. And I hope to see you in our future conversations too, whenever time permits you, and would love to know your future work, how as things are progressing. Once again, thank you very much, our audience who have been here with us and asked us great questions. And David, once again, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about these things. As you said, it's an evolving kind of discipline and ideas. So I'm curious to hear what other people think about it as well. But yeah, looking forward to talking with anyone that might be interested in connecting later on. And thanks again, Firoz, for just chatting.
Thank you, David, and thank you, our audience. Have a great evening in Bangladesh, back in there, or in whichever part of the world you are from, and in Bangladesh and in Canada. David, have a great day.
Okay.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.